Picture this scene: an intimate candlelit dinner in 1930s Berlin. Sitting directly opposite Adolf Hitler, listening intently and smiling at his stories, is Princess Sophie, the sister of Prince Philip, the future husband of the Queen of England. This is not a movie script. It is the nightmare that Buckingham Palace spent half a century trying to bury. While her brother Philip was risking his life on warships to destroy the Nazis, his own sister was raising a glass to the rise of the Third Reich. Why did a royal princess choose to make a pact with the devil? The truth is far darker than you imagine. Why did a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria become best friends with a monster? And how did the British royal family manage to whitewash the past of a woman who stood on the razor's edge between family loyalty and war crimes? To understand this dark truth, we must start at the dinner table, where a princess chose to compromise with the darkness. Princess Sophie of Greece and Denmark was born on June 26, 1914, at the Villa Mon Repos on the island of Corfu. On paper, her birth was a blessed event in the calendar of European royalty. She was the fourth daughter of Prince Andrew of Greece and Princess Alice of Battenberg. Her lineage was a dense web of imperial power. She was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, a niece of the Tsarina of Russia, and a cousin to almost every reigning monarch on the continent. However, the timing of her birth was an omen of the chaos to come. She was born on the very eve of the First World War. While she lay in her cradle, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, setting off a chain reaction that would obliterate the very monarchies her family relied upon. Sophie's early years in Greece were not filled with the idyllic sunshine that tourist brochures of Corfu suggest. They were years of intense anxiety. The Greek royal family was not a stable institution like the British monarchy. It was a foreign import. Her grandfather, King George I, was actually a Danish prince invited to rule Greece. As such, their hold on the throne was always tenuous, dependent on the volatile moods of the Greek electorate and the military. Sophie grew up in a household that was constantly packing suitcases. The family lived in the shadow of the national schism, a bitter division in Greek society between the royalists and the Venizalists. For a child, this meant an atmosphere of perpetual insecurity. She learned early on that crowds cheering for you one day could be screaming for your blood the next. The definitive trauma of Sophie's life, the event that shattered her psychological foundation, occurred in 1922. It is impossible to overstate the impact of this year on Sophie and her siblings. Greece had engaged in a disastrous military campaign in Asia Minor in an attempt to reclaim ancient Greek territories. It was a war fueled by nationalism and encouraged by the Western powers, but it ended in a horrific defeat. The Turkish army, led by Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, crushed the Greek forces. The city of Smyrna was burned to the ground, and hundreds of thousands of Greek refugees fled across the Aegean Sea. The anger in Athens was apocalyptic. The people and the military needed someone to blame for the humiliation. They turned on the royal family. A military coup led by anti-royalist officers seized power. Sophie's uncle, King Constantine I, was forced to abdicate. But the revolutionaries wanted more than just an abdication. They wanted blood. They arrested key government ministers and generals, charging them with high treason. Sophie's father, Prince Andrew, had served as a commander of the Second Army Corps during the campaign. He had disobeyed orders during the battle, orders he considered suicidal to save his men. Now that tactical decision was being framed as treason. He was arrested and transported to Athens for a show trial. Imagine the scene through the eyes of Sophie, who was 8 years old at the time. Her father was gone, locked away in a damp cell. Her mother, Princess Alice, was frantic, making desperate calls to relatives across Europe, begging for help. The atmosphere in the royal villa was one of mourning before death had even occurred. The danger was not hypothetical. On November 28, 1922, the Revolutionary Tribunal executed 6 high-ranking officials, including former prime ministers and the commander-in-chief. They were lined up against a wall and shot. This event, known as the Trial of the Six, sent a shockwave through the royal houses of Europe. It signaled that the revolutionaries were not bluffing. Prince Andrew was next on the list. For Sophie and her sisters, the fear was absolute. They were old enough to understand that their father might be killed. They heard the servants whispering. They saw the panic in their mother's eyes. This was not a game. This was the brutal reality of revolution. The lesson Sophie absorbed was clear. Being royal does not protect you. Laws do not protect you. Only strength and powerful connections can save you. Prince Andrew's life was saved by a matter of hours and the intervention of the British Secret Service. King George V of England, alarmed by the execution of the other Greek leaders, sent a clear message to the revolutionary government in Athens. If they executed Prince Andrew, diplomatic relations with Britain would be severed. Commander Gerald Talbot, a British naval attaché and former intelligence agent, arrived in Athens with a dramatic mandate. He met with the leader of the revolution, General Pangalos. The negotiations were tense. Talbot effectively threatened the Greek junta with the might of the British Empire. The tribunal eventually passed a sentence that was a mockery of justice, but a relief to the family. Prince Andrew was found guilty of disobeying orders, but due to his lack of military experience, he was stripped of his rank and banished from Greece for life. He had 24 hours to leave the country. The evacuation of the family is one of the most famous stories in royal history, usually told as a romantic adventure. In reality, it was a sordid, terrifying escape. Commander Talbot ushered the family onto the HMS Calypso, a British light cruiser. They were not boarding as honored guests. They were refugees fleeing a lynch mob. They had no time to pack their belongings. The family's wealth, their estates, their heirlooms, everything was left behind in Greece, confiscated by the new republic. Sophie walked up the gangplank holding the hand of her sister. Her mother Alice carried the 1-year-old baby Philip. Because they had no luggage, the sailors on the ship had to scramble to find a place for the baby to sleep. They found an empty orange crate, lined it with blankets, and that became the bed of the future husband of Queen Elizabeth II. The journey across the Mediterranean was brutal. The sea was rough. The ship was a warship not designed for passengers, and the family was in a state of shock. Prince Andrew sat in a cabin, shell-shocked and silent, stripped of his identity as a soldier and a prince. Princess Alice was holding herself together by a thread. For Sophie, this voyage was the dividing line of her life. Before the Calypso, she was a princess of Greece with a home and a future. After the Calypso, she was stateless. She was a girl with a grand title but no passport and no money. As the coast of Greece disappeared into the mist, Sophie lost her sense of belonging. She would spend the next decade searching for something to replace it. The family eventually disembarked in France. They had nowhere to go. They were taken in by Prince Andrew's brother George, who had married the wealthy heiress Marie Bonaparte. Marie was a fascinating figure, a disciple of Sigmund Freud, and a woman of immense intellect and fortune. She offered the refugee family a guest house in the grounds of her estate at Saint-Cloud, just outside Paris. This house became Sophie's world for the remainder of her childhood. It was a comfortable house, certainly better than a refugee camp, but for the proud Prince Andrew, it was a prison of charity. They were living entirely on the handouts of their wealthy relatives. The dynamic in St. Cloud was toxic. Prince Andrew, humiliated by his failure and his reliance on his sister-in-law's money, began to drink. He spent his days writing memoirs, trying to justify his actions during the war, obsessing over the injustice of his trial. He was physically present, but emotionally absent. Princess Alice, conversely, began to drift away from reality. The trauma of the escape, combined with her congenital deafness and a highly sensitive nature, triggered a deep spiritual crisis. She became intensely religious, converting to the Greek Orthodox faith and spending hours in prayer. Sophie and her sisters were caught in the middle. They were the poor relations of the European royal circuit. They attended parties wearing mended dresses. They were educated at home or in local schools because there was no money for prestigious boarding schools. They learned to put on a brave face, to smile for the cameras, and to maintain the stiff upper lip expected of their class. But beneath the surface, Sophie was developing a complex. She saw the wealth of her Aunt Marie Bonaparte. She saw the stability of her British cousins, and she compared it to the chaotic, shameful poverty of her own family. She hated the uncertainty. She hated the feeling of being at the mercy of others. By the late 1920s, the fragile peace at Saint-Cloud began to fracture. As Sophie entered her adolescence, her mother's behavior became increasingly erratic. Alice began to claim she was receiving divine messages. She believed she was a bride of Christ. She would drift into trances. At first, the family tried to hide it. Mental illness was a deep stigma in royal circles. But Alice's delusions became impossible to ignore. She began to hear voices that gave her instructions. She believed she had healing powers. For a teenage girl like Sophie, watching her mother descend into madness was terrifying. The one parent who had held the family together during the exile was now crumbling. Sophie, along with her sisters, had to take on the role of caregiver for their younger brother Philip. They became a tight-knit unit, a gang of 4 sisters protecting their little brother from the chaos of their parents' marriage. It was during these years in Paris that Sophie's character was forged. She was intelligent, sharper than some of her sisters, and deeply pragmatic. She realized that her father would never restore their fortune. She realized her mother could not protect them. She understood that if she wanted a life of security, she would have to find it herself. And in the Europe of the late 1920s and early 1930s, for a penniless princess with a good pedigree, there was only one way to secure a future: marriage. But Sophie didn't just want a husband. She wanted an escape from chaos. She wanted order. She wanted strength. Fatefully, she began to look toward Germany. Her mother was German by blood. Her father spoke German. Germany was the ancestral home of their dynasty. And Germany, like Sophie, was a wounded giant trying to rebuild itself from the ashes of World War I. As Sophie turned 16, she began to travel to stay with relatives in Hesse and Baden. There she saw a country that was angry, vibrant, and undergoing a radical transformation. She didn't see the danger. She saw the energy. And it was there, in the castles of the German aristocracy, that she would meet the men who would lead her down the darkest path imaginable. The tragedy of the escape from Greece was over. The tragedy of the German seduction was about to begin. If the exile from Greece was the physical displacement of Sophie's life, the events of 1930 were the emotional amputation. It is a year that stands as a tombstone in the history of the Greek royal family. Within the span of 12 months, the family unit was not just separated, it was atomized. The situation with Princess Alice in the house at St. Cloud had become untenable. Her delusions had evolved from spiritual eccentricity into full-blown psychosis. She believed she was in physical contact with Christ and Buddha. Her mood swung violently between religious ecstasy and catatonic depression. For Sophie, now 16 years old, the home had become a place of suffocating tension. The mother, who had once been their protector, was now a stranger. The decision to institutionalize Alice was made by her own mother, Victoria Mountbatten, and her husband, Prince Andrew. But they did not tell Alice. They feared she would resist. On a Tuesday morning in May 1930, a car arrived at the villa. Inside were two doctors who had been briefed on the situation. They sedated the princess. Some accounts suggest she was forcibly restrained and drove her away to a sanitarium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland. Sophie and her siblings returned home to find their mother gone. There were no goodbyes. The center of their world had been surgically removed. The trauma of this event on the teenage Sophie cannot be overstated. She had lost her country at age 8, and now at 16, she had effectively lost her mother. Alice would remain institutionalized for years, isolated from her children, convinced she had been betrayed. But the horror for the children did not end with their mother's departure. It was what happened next that truly defined their futures. With Alice locked away, one might expect Prince Andrew to step up and care for his 4 daughters and his 9-year-old son, Philip. He did the exact opposite. Andrew viewed the removal of his wife not as a tragedy to be managed, but as a release from his obligations. He closed the house at St. Cloud. He packed his bags and moved to the French Riviera to live on his yacht with his mistress, Countess André de Labigne. He effectively resigned from fatherhood. The 5 children were left homeless. This is the crucial context for Sophie's subsequent decisions. She was not a pampered princess making political choices in a vacuum. She was a 16-year-old girl who had been abandoned by both parents in a foreign country. The family was scattered to the winds. Little Philip was sent to England to be raised by his Mountbatten uncles, a move that would eventually lead him to Elizabeth II. But the girls, Margarita, Theodora, Cecilia, and Sophie, were too old for school and too young to be independent. They had to be settled. And in the aristocracy of the 1930s, settled meant married. They were shipped off to stay with various German relatives. They moved from castle to castle, living out of suitcases, dependent on the charity of their cousins. For Sophie, the humiliation of poverty was now compounded by the shame of abandonment. She was desperate for a home that no one could take away from her. To understand why Sophie walked into the arms of the Nazis, we must look at where she landed. She didn't move to the liberal, cabaret-filled Berlin of the Weimar Republic. She moved into the deep, conservative heartlands of the German aristocracy, Hesse, Baden, and Hohenlohe. The German nobility in 1930 was a class in crisis. After World War I, they had lost their Kaiser and their political dominance. They were terrified of the hyperinflation that had wiped out their cash reserves, but they were even more terrified of communism. They looked at the Soviet Union and saw a mirror of what could happen to them. Aristocrats lined up against walls and shot, their estates seized by the state. Into this vacuum of fear stepped Adolf Hitler. Hitler was shrewd. He knew he needed the legitimacy that the old nobility could provide. He courted them aggressively. He promised to protect their land, to restore the military honor of Germany, and to crush the communist threat. For the princes of Hesse and Baden, Hitler wasn't a vulgar demagogue. He was a bulwark against the Red Terror. Sophie was living in households that were becoming hotbeds of National Socialism. These were not angry mobs in beer halls. These were elegant dinner parties where princes and dukes discussed how the Nazi Party could restore Germany's glory. Sophie, young and impressionable, absorbed these conversations. She heard that Hitler was the only man who could bring order. And after a childhood defined by chaos, order was the most seductive word in the world. It was in this charged atmosphere that Sophie met Prince Christoph of Hesse. Christoph was not your average royal suitor. Born in 1901, he was 13 years older than Sophie. He was tall, severe, and undeniably imposing. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, but his mindset was thoroughly modern and radical. Christoph was a man of action. He was deeply disillusioned by the weakness of the German democratic government. Unlike many aristocrats who looked down on the Nazis as street thugs, Christoph embraced the ideology wholeheartedly. He did not join the Nazi Party out of peer pressure. He was a true believer. He joined the NSDAP in 1931, long before it was mandatory for career advancement. Even more significantly, he joined the SS. At that time, the SS was a relatively small elite organization under Heinrich Himmler, designed to be the ideological vanguard of the movement. Membership was restricted to those who could prove their Aryan purity back to the year 1750. Christoph, with his royal pedigree, was the perfect recruit. When Sophie looked at Christoph, she didn't see a fanatic, she saw a savior. Here was a man who was strong, confident, and possessed a clear vision of the future. He was wealthy, he had a stable home in Berlin and a castle in the country, and he was part of a movement that was sweeping the nation. He offered Sophie the two things she craved most: protection and purpose. The courtship was brief. Sophie was practically a child, barely 16, while Christoph was a hardened man of 29. But Sophie was eager to escape her status as a homeless refugee. They were married on December 15th, 1930, at Kronberg Castle. Sophie was just 16 years old. The wedding photos are telling. Sophie looks young, beautiful, and relieved. She had secured her future. She was now Princess Christopher of Hesse. She had a home. She had money. She was no longer the daughter of the disgraced Prince Andrew. She was the wife of a rising star in the new Germany. But by marrying Christoph, Sophie had unknowingly signed a pact. She hadn't just married a man, she had married the party. Almost immediately, Sophie's life became intertwined with the Nazi hierarchy. Christoph was not a passive member of the party, he was an active operative. His royal status gave him access to the highest levels of government, and the Nazis used him as a bridge to the old elite. Through her husband, Sophie was introduced to a social circle that would haunt her reputation forever. One of Christoph's closest associates was Hermann Goering, the World War I flying ace who would become Hitler's second in command. Goering and Christoph were close. They shared a background in aviation and a vision for the German Air Force. Sophie was frequently a guest at Goering's lavish parties, where the excesses of the Nazi elite were on full display. She saw the power, the luxury, and the confidence of these men. Compared to the sad, broken, and impoverished royals she had grown up with in Paris, the Nazis seemed vibrant and unstoppable. In her memoir, written decades later, Sophie attempted to describe her impressions of these men. She wrote about Goering's jolliness and his charisma. It is a chilling reminder of how power can mask monstrosity. Sophie was not looking for moral flaws. She was looking for validation, and the Nazi elite gave it to her. They treated her with the respect due a Greek princess and a British royal relation. They flattered her. It was inevitable that Sophie would meet the center of the universe, Adolf Hitler. Their first meetings occurred in a social context. Hitler, ever the opportunist, was charmed by Sophie. She was, after all, the sister of a potential future British royal consort and a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. To have women of her caliber in his orbit validated his regime. Sophie's own descriptions of Hitler are historically vital because they lack the hindsight of horror. She did not describe a raving lunatic. She described a man who was quiet, polite, and intensely focused. She recounted a private lunch at his apartment in Munich, where he spoke softly about his plans for Germany's cultural renaissance. I have to say, she later admitted, that although Christoph and I changed our political views fundamentally, Some years later, we were impressed by this charming and seemingly modest man, and by his apparently radical plans for improving the life of the German people. This is the crux of the tragedy. Sophie was bought. She was bought not with money, but with the illusion of national rebirth. She looked at Germany in 1932 and 1933 and saw highways being built, unemployment dropping, and national pride returning. She chose to attribute this to Hitler. She chose to ignore the brown shirts beating Jewish shopkeepers in the streets. Or perhaps, surrounded by the SS elite, she simply didn't see it. By 1933, when Hitler formally took power as chancellor, Sophie was fully embedded. She and Christoph split their time between their estates and a grand apartment in Berlin. They were the golden couple of the Third Reich's aristocratic wing. But Christoph's involvement was about to deepen in a way that would stain the family name permanently. In April 1933, Hermann Göring created the Forschungsamt. It sounds like a benign academic institution. In reality, it was the Third Reich's primary wiretapping and signals intelligence agency. It was an organization dedicated to spying on Germans and foreigners alike, intercepting phone calls, opening mail, and crushing dissent. Christoph was appointed as the head of the Forschungsamt. This is a critical detail. Sophie's husband was not just a soldier fighting on the front lines. He was the man listening to the secrets of the enemies of the Reich. He was the man helping to compile the lists of people who would be arrested, silenced, or disappeared. Sophie knew this. She knew her husband worked in intelligence. She knew his boss was Göring. She lived on the salary that this position provided. The argument that she was just an innocent housewife collapses here. She was the wife of the chief wiretapper of the Nazi regime. As the 1930s progressed, Sophie's sisters also married into the German nobility. Cecilia married Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse. Margarita married the Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Theodora married the Margrave of Baden. Suddenly, all four sisters of Prince Philip were living in Germany, married to German princes, all of whom had varying degrees of connection to the Nazi Party. Meanwhile, young Philip was in Britain, attending Gordon Stoon's school, founded by a Jewish educator, Kurt Hahn, who had fled Nazi Germany to escape persecution. The irony was absolute. Philip was being educated by a refugee from the very regime his sisters were supporting. The stage was set for the family to be torn apart by history. But before the war would sever them completely, the family would face another personal tragedy, one so shocking that it would briefly bring them all together, including Philip, for one last haunting photograph. By the mid-1930s, Princess Sophie had settled into what looked, from the outside, like a fairy tale existence. The chaos of her childhood was a distant memory. She was now the mistress of a grand household in Berlin-Dahlem, a wealthy suburb filled with the elite of the new regime. Her husband, Prince Christoph, was rising rapidly through the ranks of the SS, his uniform accruing more silver braiding and medals with each passing year. For Sophie, these were the good years. It is uncomfortable to admit, but for the German aristocracy who had aligned themselves with Hitler, life in the mid-30s was pleasant. The economy had stabilized. The threat of a communist revolution had been brutally suppressed. There were parties, hunting trips, and state dinners. Sophie gave birth to 3 daughters in quick succession: Christina, Dorothea, and Clarissa. She was fulfilling her duty as a royal wife and a German mother. However, a bizarre duality defined her life during this period. On one hand, she was hosting tea parties for the wives of Nazi potentates. On the other, she was still the sister of Prince Philip, who was now a teenager attending Gordon Stoon's school in Scotland. Philip would visit his sisters in Germany during his school holidays, Imagine the surreal nature of these visits. Philip, who was being educated by Kurt Hahn, a Jewish intellectual who had fled the Nazis, would travel to Hesse to stay with Sophie. He would sit at dinner tables surrounded by men in SS uniforms. He would hear them hailing Hitler as a genius. For young Philip, these visits must have been confusing. He loved his sister Tiny. He saw her happy and secure for the first time in years. But he also saw the swastika flags draped over the public buildings and the Juden verboten signs on the park benches. The family was straddling a geopolitical fault line, but they were trying desperately to pretend it didn't exist. The illusion that the family could exist separately from the darkness of the era was shattered on November 16th, 1937. But the blow didn't come from politics. It came from a tragedy so sudden and gruesome that it momentarily stopped the world. Sophie's beloved sister, Cecilia, was heavily pregnant with her fourth child. She, her husband Georg Donatus, their two young sons, and their mother-in-law boarded a plane to fly to London for a family wedding. The flight was doomed. Flying through thick fog, the pilot attempted an emergency landing at Ostend, Belgium. The wing clipped a factory chimney. The plane crashed, broke apart, and erupted into a fireball. Everyone on board was killed instantly. When firefighters pulled the bodies from the wreckage, they found a horror that shocked even hardened rescue workers. Beside the body of Cecilia was the body of a newborn infant. The trauma of the crash had induced labor, and she had given birth in the final, terrifying moments of her life. The news reached Sophie at her home in Berlin. The devastation was total. Cecilia wasn't just a sister. She was the glue of the four sisters. She was the one who had taken the lead in caring for Philip. Now she and her entire family were gone. The funeral that followed in Darmstadt was one of the most haunting spectacles of the 20th century. It is the moment where the private grief of a family collided publicly with the machinery of the Nazi state. Because Cecilia and her husband were high-ranking aristocrats and members of the Nazi Party, the regime turned their funeral into a state event. The streets of Darmstadt were lined with thousands of people, but they weren't just mourners. Many were uniformed stormtroopers, and walking behind the coffins was 16-year-old Prince Philip. This is the context of the infamous photograph that the producers of The Crown recreated, and that the British tabloids have revisited for decades. You see a young blonde Philip looking thin and heartbroken in a long civilian overcoat. Flanking him are his surviving brothers-in-law, Prince Christoph and Prince Philip of Hesse. They are wearing their full SS dress uniforms. The contrast is visceral. Philip represents the future of the British monarchy, walking in step with men representing the darkest evil of the century. The crowds raised their arms in the Nazi salute as the coffins passed. Sophie, veiled in black, walked in that procession, surrounded by the iconography of the regime that had claimed her loyalty. At that moment, grief united them, but it was a temporary truce. The funeral of 1937 was the last time the family would be truly together. The shadow of war was lengthening, and Philip returned to Britain, leaving Sophie behind in the heart of the beast. Less than 2 years later, on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Britain declared war. Overnight, the lines of communication were cut. Sophie was no longer just a sister living abroad. She was the wife of an enemy officer. For Philip, now a cadet at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth, his sisters became a dangerous secret. He could not write to them. He could not speak of them. To admit that his closest relatives were high-ranking Nazis would have destroyed his career before it began. For Sophie, the outbreak of war was a moment of patriotic fervor. We must be clear about this. There is no evidence that Sophie opposed the war in 1939. like millions of Germans, she had been fed a steady diet of propaganda. She believed that Germany was reclaiming its rightful place in the world. She believed the British were the aggressors, trying to encircle and strangle the fatherland. Her husband, Christoph, traded his desk job at the intelligence agency for a cockpit. He joined the Luftwaffe as a navigator and pilot. He was eager to fight. He participated in the campaigns that crushed Poland, France, and the Low Countries. Sophie stayed behind in Berlin and Hesse, raising her children. But she was not a passive observer. She was a member of the NS Frauenschaft. She organized charity drives for the Wehrmacht. She was fully integrated into the war effort. If there is one piece of evidence that strips away the defense that Sophie was merely apolitical or naive, it is the birth of her fifth child. In the summer of 1940, Germany was at the zenith of its power. France had fallen in just 6 weeks. The British army had been humiliated at Dunkirk. It seemed that Hitler's victory was inevitable. In this atmosphere of triumph, Sophie gave birth to a son. Naming a royal child is always a political act. Names are chosen to honor ancestors, to signal alliances, or to pay tribute to heroes. Sophie and Christoph made a choice that history can never ignore. They named the boy Karl Adolf. And they didn't just name him after the Führer. They asked Adolf Hitler to be the child's godfather. Hitler accepted. This was not a mandatory bureaucratic procedure. This was a request for a personal blessing from the dictator. By naming her son Adolf, Sophie was tying her family's bloodline to the Nazi ideology. She was making a permanent declaration of faith in Hitler. We have to pause and consider the implications of this. In 1940, while her brother Philip was training to defend Britain from a German invasion, Sophie was asking the man planning that invasion to bless her newborn. It is a betrayal of sibling loyalty so profound that it is difficult to comprehend. It suggests that in 1940, Sophie did not believe Britain would survive. She was betting everything on a German future. There are photos from the christening. Hitler is not present, but his representative, Wilhelm Bruckner, is there. He presented the child with a document signed by Hitler and a christening cup. Sophie looks proud. This moment, the christening of Karl Adolf, is the point of no return for Sophie. Before this, she could be painted as a victim of circumstance, a woman following her husband. But this was a personal choice. It was an embrace of the monster. But history, as Sophie would learn, is cruel to those who bet on tyrants. The euphoria of 1940 did not last. In 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Christoph was transferred to the Eastern Front. The letters he sent back to Sophie began to change in tone. The easy victories were over. He wrote of the freezing cold, the endless steppes, the fanatical resistance of the Red Army, and the brutality of the war in the East. Sophie remained in Germany, but the war began to come to her. The Royal Air Force began its bombing campaign against German cities. The sirens wailed at night. The pristine suburbs of Berlin were no longer safe. Sophie made the decision to move her children to the relative safety of Friedrichshof Castle in Kronberg. But even there, the anxiety was eating her alive. She was now the mother of 5, with a husband thousands of miles away in a living hell. And slowly, the cracks in the regime began to show. The news from the front was censored, but the death notices in the newspapers were real. The whispers about mass killings in the East began to circulate among the aristocracy, especially among those whose husbands, like Christoph, were in the SS and intelligence services. Did Sophie know about the Holocaust? This is the question that hangs over every Nazi biography. Given Christoph's high-level clearance in the intelligence services before the war and his role in the SS, It is statistically impossible that he did not know about the Einsatzgruppen operating in the East. Did he tell his wife? In her later years, Sophie claimed ignorance. She claimed they didn't know the extent of the horror. But she was a woman who had dined with Himmler. She lived in the inner circle. If she didn't know the specifics of the gas chambers, she certainly knew that the Jews were being eradicated. Her silence during these years was not a lack of knowledge. It was a survival mechanism. She shut her eyes, but she couldn't shut her eyes to the tragedy that was coming for her personally. The war had taken her sister. Now it was coming for her husband. As 1943 dawned, the German Sixth Army was dying at Stalingrad. The tide had turned. The 1,000-year Reich was crumbling. And Sophie, the godmother of the regime, was about to pay the price for her pact with the devil. By late 1943, the atmosphere in Germany had shifted from triumphalism to a grim, fatalistic dread. The cities were burning. The news from the front lines was a litany of strategic withdrawals, a euphemism for catastrophic defeat. For Princess Sophie, the war was no longer a distant political abstraction. It was a daily struggle to maintain a semblance of normalcy for her 5 children while the roof of Europe collapsed over their heads. Her husband, Prince Christoph, had become a ghost in his own home. On his rare leaves from the front, family members noted a change in him. The arrogant, swaggering SS officer of 1933 was gone. In his place was a man hollowed out by the brutality of the Eastern Front. There are reports, hotly debated by historians, that Christoph had become disillusioned with Hitler, perhaps even peripherally aware of the plots against him. But whether he was a repentant sinner or a fanatic fighting to the bitter end, his fate was sealed. On October 7, 1943, Prince Christoph boarded a plane for a reconnaissance mission over the Apennine Mountains in Italy. The flight plan was routine. The outcome was not. The plane crashed into a mountainside near Forli. There were no survivors. The news reached Sophie at Friedrichshof Castle. At the age of 29, she was a widow. The symmetry of the tragedy was cruel. 6 years earlier, her sister Cecilia had died in a plane crash. Now, the same fate had claimed her husband. But unlike Cecilia's death, which had elicited sympathy from around the world, Christoph's death was the death of an enemy combatant. There were no condolences from Buckingham Palace. There were no telegrams from her brother Philip. Christoph died wearing the uniform of the enemy, and he died alone. Sophie's position was now incredibly precarious. In Nazi Germany, a woman's status was entirely derived from her husband. As the wife of a high-ranking SS prince, she had been untouchable. As a widow, she was vulnerable. She was left with 5 children, the youngest, Hitler's godson, Karl Adolf, only 3 years old. The pension provided by the SS was substantial, but money was becoming worthless in an economy destroyed by war. Sophie retreated to Friedrichshof, the massive neo-Gothic castle built by her grandmother, the Empress Frederick. The castle became her fortress. As the Allied bombing raids intensified, turning nearby Frankfurt into a moonscape of rubble, Sophie turned the cellars of the castle into a bunker. She lived a double life, a princess in a castle, eating off silver plates while the world outside descended into the Stone Age. During this period, Sophie had to navigate a political minefield. The failed assassination attempt on Hitler in July 1944 unleashed a wave of paranoia. The Gestapo began purging the aristocracy, suspecting them of disloyalty. Sophie, despite her past connections, had to be extremely careful. One wrong word, one expression of doubt about the final victory could lead to the camps. She kept her head down, clinging to the only identity she had left, the grieving war widow. The end came not with a bang, but with the rumble of Sherman tanks. In March 1945, the U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George Patton, swept into Hesse. The local German resistance had crumbled. The SS units had fled or been annihilated. For Sophie, the arrival of the Americans was a moment of supreme cognitive dissonance. For years, Nazi propaganda had painted the Americans as gangsters and mongrels. Now they were in her driveway. The occupation of Friedrichshof Castle is a story that deserves its own movie. The American troops who rolled up to the gates were exhausted, dirty, and angry. They had just fought their way across the Rhine. They didn't care about royal titles. They saw a massive castle flying a flag, and they decided it would make an excellent officers' club. Sophie tried to stand her ground. She attempted to use her British royal connections, speaking to the officers in perfect aristocratic English. She likely reminded them that she was the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. The American commander was unimpressed. He gave the princess and her family 4 hours to pack and get out. It was the final humiliation. Sophie, the woman who had dined with Hitler, was evicted from her own home by the enemy. She and her children were forced to move into a small cottage on the estate grounds, while American GIs drank whiskey in her husband's library and put their boots on her antique furniture. But the humiliation didn't end with eviction. What followed was one of the most notorious crimes of the post-war occupation, a scandal that would drag Sophie through the courts for years. The Hesse family had hidden their crown jewels, a hoard of diamonds, rubies, and emeralds worth millions, in a sub-basement of the castle to protect them from Allied bombing. The cash included a quart jar full of loose diamonds and tiaras that had been worn by empresses. 3 American officers, Captain Kathleen Nash, Major David Watson, and Colonel Jack Durant, discovered the hiding place. Instead of reporting the find, they stole it. They smuggled the jewels out of Germany in mail packages. They broke up priceless tiaras to sell the stones on the black market. It was a looting of epic proportions. When Sophie realized the jewels were missing, she reported it to the American authorities. This act required immense courage. As a German and a suspected Nazi, reporting a crime committed by the liberators was dangerous. But Sophie was desperate. Those jewels were the only inheritance her children had left. The investigation led to a sensational court-martial. The officers were arrested, but many of the jewels were never recovered. They had been pried apart and scattered. For Sophie, it was a metaphor for her life. The legacy of the past was being dismantled piece by piece by the consequences of the war she had supported. While the jewel theft was a financial blow, the denazification process was an existential threat. After the German surrender in May 1945, the Allies began the massive task of purging Nazi influence from German society. Every adult German had to fill out a Fragebogen about their activities during the Third Reich. Sophie was in deep trouble. She couldn't hide. Her husband's rank in the SS was a matter of public record. Her membership in the Nazi Women's League was documented. The photo of her at the funeral with the SS uniforms was famous. And most damning of all, her son's name was Adolf. She was classified as a Category 2 offender. This was a serious designation. It carried the threat of imprisonment, forced labor, and the total confiscation of property. Sophie was summoned for interrogation. We have to imagine the scene. The proud princess, sitting on a wooden chair facing a panel of American and British intelligence officers. They didn't treat her like royalty. They treated her like a suspect. Did you know about the camps? Did you support the regime? Why did you meet with Hitler? Sophie's defense was consistent with the collective amnesia that swept Germany in 1945. She played the role of the naive wife. She claimed she didn't understand politics. She claimed she only joined the party organizations because it was expected of her station. She claimed she was blinded by Hitler's charm, but knew nothing of his crimes. It was a performance, a lie born of necessity. A woman as intelligent and connected as Sophie could not have been ignorant, but the Allies were pragmatic. They were more interested in hanging the architects of the Holocaust than in imprisoning widowed princesses. With 5 children, Sophie avoided prison, but she was fined, stripped of her voting rights for a time, and placed under travel restrictions. She was a pariah in her own country, a symbol of the aristocracy's failure. While Sophie was being interrogated in a cold room in Frankfurt, what was her brother doing? In 1945 and 1946, Prince Philip was a war hero. He had served with distinction in the Royal Navy. He was present in Tokyo Bay when the Japanese surrendered. He was returning to London not as a refugee but as a victor, and he was in love. His romance with Princess Elizabeth, the future queen, was becoming serious. Philip knew that his German connections were a ticking time bomb. The British public hated the Germans with a ferocity that is hard to imagine today. The war had killed 450,000 Britons. The cities were still rubble. Rationing was stricter than during the war. If the press found out that Philip's sister was a Category 2 Nazi offender who had named her son after Hitler, the marriage would be impossible. The monarchy could not survive such a scandal. So a wall of silence was erected. Philip and Sophie did not speak. There were no visits. When Sophie wrote letters, they were likely screened or destroyed. She was the dirty secret that had to be contained. This is the tragedy of 1946. Sophie was at the lowest point of her life, widowed, broke, interrogated, humiliated. She needed her brother more than ever, but her brother had to cut her loose to save himself and the British crown. She was left to scavenge for food and coal in the ruins of the 1,000-year Reich, while he prepared to move into Buckingham Palace. However, Sophie was a survivor. She was not going to fade away into the rubble. In 1946, amidst the chaos, she reconnected with an old acquaintance, Prince George William of Hanover. He was a cousin, a Guelph prince, and a decent man. He was everything Christoph was not: calm, apolitical, and kind. They fell in love. It was a romance born of shared trauma. They married in April 1946 in Salem. This marriage saved Sophie. It gave her a new name, a new title, and a new level of protection. She was no longer just the SS widow. She was the Princess of Hanover. It allowed her to begin the process of laundering her reputation. But even as she rebuilt her private life, the greatest public humiliation was yet to come. The calendar was turning to 1947. In London, the royal wedding was being planned. The invitations were being printed. Sophie waited for hers. She believed that the war was over, that family was family. She believed that her brother would want her there on the most important day of his life. She was wrong. November 1947. In London, the excitement was electric. The gray fog of post-war austerity was being pierced by the technicolor spectacle of a royal wedding. Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten was marrying Princess Elizabeth. It was being billed as a symbol of national rebirth, a reaffirmation that Britain had survived the dark days of the Blitz and was still a global power. In the Lord Chamberlain's office at Buckingham Palace, the guest list was being finalized. It was a diplomatic minefield. Every name was scrutinized for its political implications. In Germany, Princess Sophie waited. Despite the humiliation of the interrogation camps and the seizure of her jewels, she held on to a naive hope. Philip was her little brother. She had bathed him, fed him, and protected him when their mother was dragged away to the asylum. Surely, on the most important day of his life, he would want his family by his side. The rejection, when it came, was total. It wasn't just that the invitation didn't arrive, it was that the prohibition was made explicit. Sophie and her two surviving sisters, Margarita and Theodora, were told in no uncertain terms that they were not welcome on British soil. The reason was brutal political calculus. The advisors to King George VI were terrified of the optics. Imagine the headlines: "The future queen marries the brother-in-law of a Nazi spy." Imagine the newsreels showing Sophie, the woman who had christened her son Adolf, walking down the aisle of Westminster Abbey, just a few feet behind the King of England. The British public, still mourning their 450,000 dead, would have revolted. Philip, to his credit, reportedly tried to argue for them, but he was outranked. He was a penniless prince marrying the heir to the throne. He had no leverage. He had to accept the condition. To marry Elizabeth, he had to disown his past. So on November 20th, 1947, Sophie sat in her home in Germany, likely listening to the crackling broadcast of the ceremony on the radio. She heard the bells ringing. She heard the crowds cheering. She heard her brother promise to love and cherish a woman she had never met. The exclusion was a public branding. It confirmed to the world that Sophie was not just a German relative, she was a pariah. She was toxic waste. For the next few years, a wall of silence descended. This period, from 1947 to roughly 1951, represents the Cold War within the royal family. Sophie was busy rebuilding her life with her second husband, Prince George William of Hanover. They lived quietly, trying to stay off the radar of the press. But the connection to Philip was a constant undercurrent. Philip, now the Duke of Edinburgh, began a campaign of secret diplomacy. He knew he couldn't bring his sisters to London, so he began going to them. He would slip away for private visits to Germany. These trips were kept off the court circular. There were no official photos. We have to imagine the atmosphere of these reunions. They took place in the castles of Salem and Wolfsgarten. The siblings would gather: Philip, the war hero in his tweed suits, and his sisters, the widows of the enemy. What did they talk about? Did Philip confront Sophie about the wiretapping agency? Did he ask about the dinner with Hitler? The evidence suggests they did not. They engaged in a family omerta, a code of silence. To preserve their relationship, they had to pretend the war was just a bad dream that happened to other people. They spoke of horses, of children, of the estates. They buried the truth under layers of polite conversation. This denial was the price of reconciliation. If Philip had demanded accountability, the family would have shattered forever. He chose peace over truth. The death of King George VI in 1952 changed the dynamic. Philip's wife was now Queen Elizabeth II. Philip was no longer a subordinate suitor. He was the consort. He had power. And he used that power to bring his sisters back from the wilderness. The coronation of 1953 was the test case. Philip insisted that his sisters be invited. The establishment resisted, but the queen, who loved Philip and understood his pain, agreed. Sophie received the invitation. It was her ticket back into respectable society, but the rehabilitation was carefully stage-managed. Sophie, Margarita, and Theodora were invited, but they were treated like phantom guests. They did not ride in the glass coaches. They did not appear on the balcony. They were smuggled into the abbey and seated in the choir stalls, visible but not prominent. For Sophie, wearing a long gown and a tiara, sitting in the hallowed air of Westminster Abbey, it must have felt like a hallucination. 6 years earlier, she was being grilled by American intelligence officers about her Nazi Party membership. Now she was watching her sister-in-law being anointed with holy oil. The duality of her existence was complete. She was a Nazi princess in Germany and a royal aunt in England. She had learned to switch masks with terrifying ease. However, not everyone in the palace was willing to play the game of forgive and forget. Sophie faced a formidable enemy, the Queen Mother. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon was the moral conscience of the war generation. She had walked through the rubble of Buckingham Palace when it was bombed by the Luftwaffe. She despised the Germans. She famously referred to them as the Huns. To her, Sophie wasn't family. She was the enemy. Insiders and biographers have documented the icy tension that existed whenever Philip's sisters visited. The Queen Mother would reportedly refuse to speak to them in German, forcing them to speak English. She would arrange her schedule to avoid dining with them. Sophie, ever the pragmatist, learned to navigate this minefield. She knew her place. She was the poor relation with the dark past. She stayed in the background. She didn't give interviews. She didn't complain. She accepted the Queen Mother's hostility as the tax she had to pay for access to her brother. If the older generation hated her, the younger generation was a different story. And this is where the character of Sophie becomes most complex and difficult to reconcile. To Prince Charles and Princess Anne, she wasn't a villain. She was Aunt Tiny. Sophie was a frequent visitor to the nursery, and later to the schools where the royal children were educated. In fact, Prince Charles was sent to Gordonstoun in Scotland, but he also spent a term at Salem in Germany, the school run by the family of Sophie's second husband. During his time in Germany, Charles spent weekends with Aunt Tiny. He adored her. Sophie was intellectual, well-read, and possessed a dry, sharp wit, very similar to Philip's. She didn't treat Charles like a future king. She treated him like a nephew. She cooked for him. She walked in the woods with him. This humanizes Sophie in a way that makes her crimes even more disturbing. It is easy to hate a monster who is cruel 24 hours a day. It is much harder to judge a woman who was a loving, nurturing aunt to the future King of England, but who also named her son after Hitler. Sophie proved that a person can be kind to their family and indifferent to the suffering of millions. She could weep over a scraped knee of her nephew, yet remain dry-eyed about the Holocaust. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, Sophie settled into the role of the good German. This was a cultural archetype adopted by millions of Germans after the war. The narrative went like this: we were not Nazis, we were patriots. We didn't know about the crimes. We were seduced by a madman. We were victims too. Sophie perfected this script. In her rare interactions with people outside the family circle, she projected an air of tragic dignity. She spoke of the loss of her first husband as a war tragedy, equating his death in a Luftwaffe plane with the deaths of Allied soldiers. She flattened the moral landscape until everyone was just a victim of the war. She never publicly apologized. She never renounced her first husband's actions. In fact, she kept the photos of Christoph in his SS uniform on her desk. She honored his memory, and the British royal family allowed her to do this. They didn't demand an apology. They just wanted quiet. As long as Sophie didn't cause a scandal, as long as the press didn't dig up the old photos, she was allowed to be Aunt Tiny. But the past has a way of rotting if it isn't buried deep enough. In the late 1960s, a new generation of journalists and historians began to ask questions. The silence of the post-war years was breaking. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961 had brought the details of the Holocaust into every living room in the world. The excuse we didn't know was becoming harder to sustain. Sophie began to retreat further into her private life. She sensed the change in the wind. She spent her time at her cottage in Schliersee, Bavaria, surrounded by her grandchildren and her books. She was aging, the beautiful, sharp-featured princess of the 1930s, was becoming a stoic, white-haired matriarch. She had outlived the 1,000-year Reich. She had outlived the British Empire. She was a relic of a world that had destroyed itself. But she had one final role to play. She was the keeper of the secrets. She held the memories of the family's darkest hours. She knew exactly what had been said at those dinner tables in Berlin. She knew who had promised what to whom. And as she entered the twilight of her life, the question remained, would she take those secrets to the grave? Or would she finally speak the truth about the sister of the Queen's husband and the godmother of the Nazi elite? The end of her life would not be marked by a confession, but by a quiet, stubborn endurance, a refusal to look back. Because to look back would be to admit that her entire life, her choices, her marriages, her loyalties, had been a catastrophic moral failure. As the 1970s turned into the 1980s, Princess Sophie entered the winter of her life. She was no longer the glamorous, sharp-eyed aristocrat who had charmed the Nazi elite in Berlin. She was an elderly grandmother living in the quiet, scenic beauty of Schliersee in Bavaria. But age did not bring silence. It brought a desire to explain. Historians often speak of the memoir defense, the tendency of former Nazi sympathizers to write their histories not to confess, but to contextualize. Sophie began to organize her papers. She wrote a memoir intended primarily for her family, but later accessed by biographers, in which she attempted to wrestle with the ghost of her past. The contents of these writings are perhaps the most damning evidence against her, precisely because she thought they exonerated her. In her own handwriting, she did not describe a woman forced into submission by a totalitarian regime. She described a woman who was intellectually and emotionally aligned with it. She wrote of the 1930s with a disturbing nostalgia. She described the energy of the National Socialist movement. She reiterated her impression of Hitler from their private lunches. Modest, charming, a man of simple tastes. Even 40 years after the Holocaust, after the images of Auschwitz had been burned into the collective consciousness of humanity, Sophie could still write about the Führer's beautiful eyes. This is a psychological phenomenon known as cognitive dissonance. For Sophie to admit that Hitler was a monster, she would have to admit that she had loved a monster, that she had married a monster, and that she had dedicated the prime of her life to a monstrous cause. That burden of guilt was too heavy for the human psyche to bear. So she constructed a fortress of denial. She convinced herself that there were two Hitlers, the private, gentlemanly visionary she knew, and the public tyrant who went mad later. It was a lie, but it was the lie that allowed her to sleep at night. While Sophie was polishing her defense in Bavaria, the world was preparing to honor the one member of her family who had taken the opposite path, her mother, Princess Alice. In 1994, a historic event took place in Jerusalem. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, honored Princess Alice as righteous among the nations. During the Nazi occupation of Athens in World War II, at the exact same time Sophie was hosting SS officers in Germany, Princess Alice had hidden a Jewish family, the Cohens, in the attic of her residence. She used her deafness as a ruse to fool the Gestapo, pretending she couldn't understand their questions. She risked her life daily to save them. Prince Philip flew to Jerusalem to accept the award on his mother's behalf. He stood in the Hall of Remembrance, wearing a yarmulke, and planted a tree in her memory. He spoke movingly of her courage. She was a person with deep religious faith, and she would have considered it to be a perfectly natural human action to fellow beings in distress. The contrast between the sisters and the mother could not have been more violent. It was a moral chasm. On one side, Alice, the mad mother who was locked away, who ended up saving Jews and living as a nun. On the other side, Sophie, the sane daughter, who sought order and stability, who ended up dining with Hitler and marrying an SS chief. Sophie was alive in 1994. She was 80 years old. We have no record of her reaction to her mother's award. Did she feel shame? Did she feel that her mother's sainthood cast an even darker shadow over her own sins? The irony is that the crazy mother was the only one who saw the moral truth, while the rational daughter was completely blind to it. The ceremony in Jerusalem was the final judgment on the family's divided soul. Alice was canonized by history. Sophie was condemned by it. By the 1990s, the Gang of Four Sisters was gone. Cecilia had died in the 1937 crash. Theodora died in 1969. Margarita died in 1981. Sophie was the last one left. She became the repository of the family's pre-war memories. She was the only person alive who remembered the smell of the orange groves in Corfu before the exile. She was the only one who remembered the sound of the HMS Calypso's engines. And for Prince Philip, she was the only remaining link to his childhood. This created a complex dynamic in Philip's later years. As he aged, the Duke of Edinburgh became more sentimental about his Greek roots. He began to visit Sophie more frequently. These visits were covert operations. Philip would fly into Munich or Frankfurt on a private plane. There were no press releases. He would drive to Sophie's home in Schliersee. Witnesses describe a touching, almost desperate affection between the two octogenarians. They would speak in a mix of English, German, and French, the Royal Esperanto of their youth. They would laugh about their eccentric aunts and uncles. For Philip, Sophie wasn't the Nazi. She was tiny. She was the sister who had made him sandwiches when they were starving in Paris. She was the one who had hugged him when their father abandoned them. The bond of trauma, the trauma of 1922, of the exile of the broken home, was stronger than the political divide. But even in these warm reunions, the elephant in the room remained. Philip, the war hero who had fought for freedom, was breaking bread with the woman who had christened her son Adolf. They never resolved this. They simply stepped around it, like walking around a bomb crater in the living room. In 1958, Sophie's second husband, Prince George William, became the head of the Salem School and a respected figure. But he passed away in the late 20th century, leaving Sophie a widow for the second time. Her final years were solitary. She lived in a modest house surrounded by photos, not just photos of her children, but photos of the glory days. Biographers who visited her noted that she kept a framed photograph of Prince Christoph, her first husband, the SS officer, prominently displayed. This is a critical detail. It signifies that she never truly repented. To keep the photo of a man in an SS uniform on your desk in the 1990s, Germany was a statement. It was a refusal to be ashamed. It was a declaration that her love for him was greater than the world's judgment of his crimes. She spent her days listening to classical music, Wagner was a favorite naturally, and reading biographies. She watched the world change. She saw the reunification of Germany, the fall of the Soviet Union, and the rise of a new Europe. She was a dinosaur from an age of empires, living in the age of the internet. The end came in the autumn of 2001. The world was reeling from the September 11th attacks in New York. The geopolitical landscape was shifting again. In a nursing home in Munich, Princess Sophie of Greece and Denmark, Princess of Hesse, Princess of Hanover, was fading. She was 87 years old. Prince Philip made one last dash to Germany. He knew it was the end. He sat by her bedside. We do not know what was said in those final hours. Did she confess? Did she ask for forgiveness? Or did they just talk about the old days in Mon Repos? Given Sophie's character, proud, stoic, unyielding, it is unlikely there was a tearful repentance. She likely died as she lived, convinced of her own rectitude. She passed away on November 24th, 2001. The funeral took place at Wolfsgarten Castle, the ancestral home of the Hesse family. It was a gray, chilly day. The visual of the funeral was a stark bookend to the funeral of 1937. In 1937, a young Philip had walked behind a coffin, surrounded by men in Nazi uniforms and crowds giving the Hitler salute. In 2001, an old Philip walked behind the coffin of the last sister who had been there that day. This time, there were no swastikas, there were no shouting crowds. There were only a few dozen mourners in black coats. The silence was heavy. Prince Philip looked devastated. With Sophie's death, the original family, the family of Andrew and Alice, was extinct. He was the last man standing. But the media coverage of the death was minimal. The British papers ran small obituaries, mostly focusing on her relation to the Queen. They mentioned her troubled times in the war, using euphemisms to cover the ugly truth. The palace press office worked hard to ensure that the headlines didn't scream, "Hitler's friend dies." They wanted her to go quietly into the night. They buried her in the family cemetery at Schliersee. Her grave is modest. The inscription gives her titles. It does not mention her godson. It does not mention the Forschungsamt. It does not mention the dinners at the Reich Chancellery. Stone does not speak, but history does. Sophie was gone, but the archives were just beginning to open. The omerta that had protected her for 50 years died with her. Now historians could finally look at the letters, the diaries, and the guest lists without fear of offending a living royal relative. The death of Sophie marked the end of the human connection to the scandal. But it marked the beginning of the historical reckoning. The Nazi princess was no longer a person. She was a case study in the seduction of evil. When Princess Sophie died in 2001, the British royal family likely breathed a collective sigh of relief. The last living link to the Hesse problem, the embarrassing Nazi connection, was gone. They hoped that the story would be buried with her in the snowy graveyard of Schliersee. For decades, the strategy of omerta had worked. The public knew Philip had German sisters, but the gruesome details, the SS uniforms, the lunch with Hitler, the godson named Adolf, had been successfully quarantined in the footnotes of academic history books. But in the digital age, secrets have a half-life. Shortly after Sophie's death, the protective seal around the royal archives began to erode. In 2006, the release of previously classified MI5 files regarding the abdication of Edward VIII and the Marburg files renewed public interest in the royal family's wartime relationships. Historians began to cross-reference the timelines. They started looking closely at the guest lists of the 1930s. Suddenly, Sophie was no longer just an elderly aunt. She was a subject of forensic historical investigation. Documentaries like Channel 4's Prince Philip, The Plot to Make a King, and the global phenomenon of Netflix's The Crown dragged the Hesse sisters out of the shadows and into high definition. For the first time, millions of viewers saw the dramatized reenactment of the 1937 funeral. They saw the swastikas. They saw the young Philip walking among the Nazis. The shock was palpable. The question on social media and in op-eds was unanimous. Why didn't we know this? The answer is that the royal family is the most successful PR firm in history, but even they could not hold back the tide of information forever. Sophie's life became the smoking gun that proved the House of Windsor was not the purely British, anti-fascist monolith it claimed to be. It was a European dynasty with deep, bleeding roots in the very country that had tried to destroy Britain. Why does Sophie's story matter today? Why should we care about a princess who died 20 years ago? Because Sophie is the perfect embodiment of Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil. When we think of Nazi villains, we think of monsters like Amon Goeth or Joseph Mengele, sadists who reveled in cruelty. But Sophie was not a sadist. She was a gardener. She was a mother. She was a lover of art and music. She was polite to her servants. She was civilized. And yet she was an accessory to genocide. Sophie teaches us a terrifying lesson. You don't have to be a psychopath to be a Nazi. You just have to be an opportunist. You just have to value your own comfort, your own status, and your own security above the lives of others. Sophie didn't join the Nazis because she wanted to kill Jews. She joined because she was tired of being poor. She joined because she was tired of the chaos of the Weimar Republic. She joined because Christoph looked handsome in his uniform, and the party promised to restore the aristocracy to its former glory. She represents the millions of respectable people who paved the way for tyranny. Tyrants like Hitler cannot rise on the backs of thugs alone. They need the Sophies of the world, the educated elite who lend their credibility to the regime. By hosting Hitler at her dinner table, Sophie normalized him. She told the world, look, this man isn't a barbarian. He is fit to dine with the granddaughter of Queen Victoria. That is a crime far more insidious than pulling a trigger. It is the crime of legitimization. We must also reconsider the life of Prince Philip through the lens of this story. For 70 years, Philip was the Iron Duke, the brusque, gaffe-prone, fiercely patriotic consort of the Queen. He was the ultimate British public servant. But behind that mask, he was carrying a secret burden that would have crushed a lesser man. Every year, on Remembrance Sunday, Philip would stand at the cenotaph in London, wearing his Royal Navy uniform, laying a wreath to honor the soldiers killed by the Nazis. And every year, he knew that his own brothers-in-law were among the men who had killed them. He had to live a double life. In public, he was the enemy of the Third Reich. In private, he was the brother of its supporters. This explains Philip's legendary toughness. He sacrificed his own sisters to save the crown. Having watched the Greek throne collapse, he refused to let the House of Windsor suffer the same fate. He effectively erased Sophie from his public narrative, a ruthless decision, but one that ensured the monarchy's survival. He chose duty over blood. We must also ask the chilling, what if? If Hitler had won, Sophie wouldn't be the shameful aunt. She would have been a power broker in a Nazi-dominated Europe. By naming her son Karl Adolf, she placed a bet on that future. The fact that she lost the wager doesn't change the fact that she made it. So, was she a victim or a villain? She was both, but her choices define her. Her mother, Princess Alice, faced the same exile and deafness, yet she risked her life to hide Jews. The contrast is the final nail in Sophie's reputation. When darkness fell over Europe, Alice lit a candle. Sophie toasted the darkness with champagne. Ultimately, human justice failed in the case of Princess Sophie. She avoided prison, kept her wealth, and died in a warm bed. But historical justice is patient. It has finally stripped away the veil to reveal the ugly truth Buckingham Palace tried to bury. The battle line between good and evil didn't just run between nations. It ran right down the middle of the royal dining table. The Queen's sister-in-law dined with the devil, and no amount of royal silence can ever change that fact.